Internationally recognized psychologist Dr. Diane Langberg has encountered the crushing trauma of sexual abuse, domestic abuse, and rape, and its cover-up. Even more tragic, she's encountered all of this within the church. But as she explains today, there is a better way. Welcome to the Royce Report, a podcast dedicated to reporting the truth and restoring the church. I'm Julie Royce, and today, Dr. Diane Langberg joins me to discuss her new book, When the Church Harms God's People. The fact that abuse occurs at all in the church is horrific, but as listeners to this podcast know, abuse is happening in the church, and too often the perpetrators are protected, and the victims bear the brunt of not just the abuse, but the cover-up. In her new book, Dr. Langberg confronts this horrific evil, and she unveils what she's learned about how churches cause harm and why Christian communities often foster unhealthy leaders who end up hurting rather than protecting God's people. She also offers hope for the future, describing how churches can reflect Christ, not just in what they teach, but in how they care for themselves and for others. We'll get to this insightful interview in just a moment, but first, I'd like to thank the sponsors of this podcast, the Restore Conference, and Marquardt of Barrington.
If you're someone who's experienced church hurt or abuse, there are few places you can go to pursue healing. Similarly, if you're an advocate, counselor, or pastor, there are few conferences designed to equip you to minister to people traumatized in the church. But the Restore Conference, this February 7th and 8th in Phoenix, Arizona, is designed to do just that. Joining us will be leading abuse survivor advocates like Mary DeMuth and Dr. David Pooler, an expert in adult clergy sexual abuse. Also joining us will be Scott McKnight, author of A Church Called Tove, Diane Langberg, a psychologist and trauma expert, yours truly, and more. For more information, just go to restore2025.com. That's restore2025.com. Also, if you're looking for a quality new or used car, I highly recommend my friends at Marquardt of Barrington. Marquardt is a Buick GMC dealership where you can expect honesty, integrity, and transparency. That's because the owners there, Dan and Kurt Marquardt, are men of integrity. To check them out, just go to buyacar123.com.
Well, again, joining me today is Dr. Diane Langberg, an internationally recognized psychologist with more than 5 decades of clinical experience with trauma victims. She's also trained caregivers on 6 continents in responding to trauma and the abuse of power. She's also written several books, including her latest, When the Church Harms God's People. So, Diane, welcome. It is such a pleasure to have you join me.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Well, and I've said this to you before in person. I don't know that I've ever said it in a podcast, but I do consider you the matriarch of the abuse survivor community and someone who is not just special because of your trauma experience, but I think because of your faith that has endured really trudging through some amazingly toxic stuff. So again, just such an honor and a pleasure to be with you. And I know last year, at Restore, you weren't able to be with us because you were writing this book. So I am thrilled that you're done and able to be with us at the Restore coming up in Phoenix.
I'm thrilled to be done too.
And I hope you appreciate that we're going to be in Phoenix instead of Chicago when it's February.
Right.
So your book talks about when the church harms God's people. And obviously, the church is supposed to be a place of healing and of comfort, but it ceased to be this in some cases. And I know there's a myriad of reasons for why this has happened. But if you could kind of put your finger on, here's the main reason that I see contributing to what we're seeing in the church today, what would you say that is?
So rather than the love in those places, we are protecting a system that we think is truth and makes us safe and all those kinds of things. But last I checked, Jesus didn't die for systems.
And so often it's the shepherd that is at fault for preying on the sheep. I mean, here we have a shepherd that's supposed to protect sheep, and instead we have shepherds who are preying on them, which is just the antithesis of who Jesus is, the antithesis of who they are supposed to be. But sometimes, in fact, probably in 100% of these cases, when there's a shepherd who is not really a shepherd, but he's a wolf parading as one, it's deception that's happening. Why is it, like, how can we tell whether a shepherd who can be incredibly charming, right? Say all the right words and all those things. How can we tell if this person is actually a shepherd or if he's a wolf in sheep's clothing?
Well, I think the way that Jesus put it is by their fruits you will know them. I think that we have fallen into the trap, I suppose, of measuring fruit by success, which if we measure fruit by success, then Jesus failed.
So what would you say fruit is?
It's likeness to him. I mean, when we're taught about the fruit of the Spirit, it means someone who loves. It means someone who treats others with respect and kindness and protects the sheep because of their preciousness eternally to the shepherd.
And yet so often it is true when I get pushback for the type of reporting that we do exposing someone who has been a very bad shepherd, that is often what I hear. What about the fruit? And when they say fruit, they mean the numbers,
yes,
right?
Numbers and money and fame. That's the fruit, which is not fruit of Christ.
One of the questions that I get asked a lot, and I think it varies from person to person, but they ask, were these predator pastors, did they begin bad and they just conned people the whole time, into their positions? Or are these people who maybe had good intentions to begin with, maybe were good people to begin with, and the pressures of the system began to change who they were? What would you say to those who ask that question?
Well, I think the first honest thing I would say is I don't know. But I think that there is a spectrum of some are this way, some are this way, some are this. So some start out, really intending to do good and things. But part of what runs through, I think a lot of it is that certainly the Christians in general and places like seminaries and things do not put a lot of expectation or whatever on who you are. It's what you know how to do and do well and how well it is happening and how big it is. But if you go back to the Gospels and look at the things that Jesus spoke, so much of it is about character. And by their fruit, you will know them. And the fruit he's talking about is not how many members you have in your pews. It's your character. It's your heart. It's the way you speak. It's the way you treat the least of these. Those are all the things that measured him. And they are to measure us. And I think we've lost our way. And I think that's a global issue.
Do you think, too, the megachurch movement, and I've been asked this as well, are megachurch is just inherently bad? And I'm like, well, no. I mean, there are some megachurches that do good work, and there's people who have been saved through these megachurches, who have been discipled through them. But I think for the pastor, I have seen that it seems like all the pressures in a megachurch are in the wrong direction. Mm-hmm. I'm curious what you would say that you've seen with our churches today and whether they help spiritual formation for these leaders or whether they seem to work in the opposite direction.
The pressure is terrible. The expectations are extravagant and everything has God's name on it. So if you aren't meeting the pressure and you aren't bringing in lots of people and people aren't talking about how wonderful you are, you're not doing a good job. If those are the criteria, then Jesus didn't do a good job. And so the care of the shepherd, the personality of the shepherd, the heart that not is just given in words, but in deed, all of those things show us who a shepherd is. And we are measuring by outcome. I mean, again, you go back to the cross or to the resurrection, there were not very many people about looking for him. And I think that we love the institution, and it is feels safe to us, and it feels like God must be on our side because we have 3,000 members or whatever, when in fact he's called us to love and to patience and to self-control and things like that. That's how we look like him, how we serve him, and how we woo others to him.
Well, it is centered around a celebrity so often. And this can happen in large churches, mega churches. This can happen in small churches. I mean, where the pastor can be, the big fish in the small pond just as much as, the celebrity pastor in this big institution. And I think when we complain about the pastor or about the institution, we also have to look at ourselves, don't we? Because we're the consumers of these type of churches. We are the ones that give money to these churches. What responsibility do we have as lay people to ensure that our churches are better?
I'm not even sure that I would start thinking about it that way, because to ensure our churches are better means to ensure a system is good. And Jesus didn't die for systems. So the question is, number one, for me, on my face, asking him where I am not like him, to teach me that, and to teach me how to become more like him in those ways. Part of what doing that and living there, not just doing it once or something, but living in that space with God, also sharpens our eyes and our ears, and we begin to recognize things that may be painted beautifully, but look nothing like Christ. I think until that happens, the system is evidence of God, which it's not, whether it's a church or a political one or whatever it is. None of that is his fruit. It's who we are in the places that we live that is to be his fruit.
Something I've really appreciated about you, and I'm hearing it in this interview, but it's also in your writings. One of my favorite book, actually, of yours is that little, it's just a tiny paperback book on meditations for counselors. Mm-hmm. And I have found that it's not just meditations for counselors, it's meditations really for anybody who's in work that does take them through some of the grossest evil that's out there and how to protect your soul. And I so appreciate that. And that, I know I read it. I said this at the last Restore because I went through a very difficult time prior to it. And I read those meditations. I went through that book twice just because I found that I needed to protect my soul.
Yes.
So carefully, because again, the pressures are just not in the right direction. And I know my own flesh, when I encounter these systems, makes me so angry, makes me, just, and you can't not when you hear the way that people have abused.
Jesus cracked whips and turns tables over. So I don't think he liked it much either.
And that's something that I say regularly. And people are like, you sound angry. And I'll be like, why aren't you angry? Like, this should make us angry, genuinely. Yet at the same time, Satan will use that as an opportunity in our own hearts. And you talk about in your book about the role that deception plays. And I this was so good. And let's start with the predator himself, right? How deception works with someone who is, again, preying on the sheep rather than protecting the sheep. Often, I wonder if they even admit to themselves what they're doing.
Often not. I think that, obviously we are deceptive creatures. There's no exceptions. The only exception was Christ. And so we carry that around, and it was started in Edom. I didn't do it. That girl did it.
Right. Blame it on the woman.
Right, of course. But it's been in us since the beginning. And so our go-to thing is when somebody points the finger at us about anything, whether it's true or not, our first thing is to take care of ourselves. That's our automatic response. And if what they have given us is true, we have to make it untrue. There's some way we want to make it untrue because it disturbs us if we make it true. We don't want them to think about that. It's going to hurt our job. It's going to do whatever. So I don't think we have really understood the depth of that and its claws on us. And I think that makes us very vulnerable.
Yeah, I'm still stunned. James McDonald, who I reported on back, I mean, it started in 2018, but then he was fired from his church in 2019, and most of the elders stepped down. He is out there now today, even after assaulting a 59-year-old woman and breaking her femur. He is still out there proclaiming his innocence, and even with that, blaming it on PTSD that he got from me reporting. And this 59-year-old woman supposedly triggered. But by the way, just curious of your professional opinion on PTSD being triggered in a situation like that, to actually assault somebody.
It's a great cover-up on their side.
And what's shocking is he got a professional counselor in court to say that.
If someone has been doing terrible things and actually really begins to see it and is hit by what they have done and grieving by what they have done, having them look like they have PTSD would be expected. But it's at their own hands that it's there. It's not you did this or said this, therefore I feel this, which many abusers would do.
And it is interesting how the blame often goes everywhere except on the one person who's caused it. Let's talk about deception now with the abused, and even with systems. I mean, it does always, I find it difficult to wrap my head around, although I know it happens and I believe it happens. But the idea that somebody could be sexually abusing you, and yet you think that this is somehow okay spiritually, like you're a Christian and you're able to believe the lies that are told you. Talk about that dynamic and how that plays into it.
Well, I would say, first of all, that I don't think we have really very much understanding of how deep deception is in all of us. No exceptions. The only exception is Jesus Christ. And we do it quickly and easily, and anybody who's raised children realizes it takes about 2 seconds after birth for them to figure it out. Not really.
Yes.
But you don't have to teach them. It's there. And so the way that we think is flawed. And I don't think we start with that premise. You know, we know other people where it's flawed, but we're doing the right thinking, and we don't expose or look at ourselves in those ways. So I think we have very little understanding of the depth of deception in individual humans, often on a daily basis, and then how that shapes and controls systems, which only reinforce the deception that we have because we like the system. So it's here since the beginning. It's got deep roots. And when I was a young girl, one of my grandmothers lived in the mountains of West Virginia. And I was staying with her for a couple of days. And she said to me, go downstairs to the cellar and bring up the clothes that we were washing. So I do. And we're talking about a dirt floor cellar and the whole thing, you know. So I go down into the cellar to get the clothes. And I started crying and screaming. And my grandmother came running, and I came running up the stairs. And she turned on the lights. And she said, watch. And then she said to me, if you turn on the lights, the rats will run. And that came back to me some years ago in terms of deception in organizations, in myself, in leaders, in whatever, turning on the lights. And that's what Jesus did and does. Rats run. And then we have to make a choice. Number one, are we going to turn on the light? Which most of us are very uncomfortable. I mean, Adam and Eve hid. I get that. Turn on the light and they will run.
So good. I know at Restore in 2022, you made the comment, it says how to, when you were addressing how to recognize a wolf in the church. And you said, well, one way is to not become one. And I saw some pushback to that. I thought it was a fantastic point because I think we all have this. And if we deny that we have it, that's almost the scariest situation, because if you are not attending to your own heart, that's when I think you are most likely to fall into this. But some people said, oh, wait, isn't this sin leveling? Because it takes a special kind of evil to, be a pedophile or to sexually abuse someone. And not all of us are there. Speak to those folks who were saying that. And I think, I understand where they're coming from.
Yes.
What would you say to them?
Well, I think, first of all, sin in itself is on a continuum. I mean, some sins do hideous damage to people that all the help in the world isn't going to undo. It's not going to go away really until they see the face of Jesus. There are other things that we do that we see and we stop doing, or other people see us stop and we change and things. It's all on a continuum. And the problem is, if you have, let's say as an adolescent, you start doing things to cover up things, which is pretty common in adolescence, frankly. Did you do this? No, I didn't do this. Were you in this place? No, I was not. So forth.
I'm not sure it's just adolescence.
Oh, I know it's not. but the point is that it's very young. And it happens when you can have a toddler. You ask them, did they do some? Did you spill this? No. Darn sure they were. They spilled it.
It reminds me of my grandson, 4-year-old grandson, who was asked if he did something. And he said, no, my mind made me do that. My mind told me to do that. I know, right?
Well, that's a keeper, number one. And number two, you teach him when he has a different level brain to look at himself. But yes, it's in all of us. And so when I said that, what I'm saying is, don't live even minorly in the way that perpetrators live. Don't excuse harm to others. It doesn't have to be sexual abuse. You could be a rude person. Don't excuse that rudeness. Don't treat other people as if they have no value, or they can easily be discarded, or whatever. So it is the things that grow and control, if we keep doing them, that we don't theoretically want to do. And that's what I mean by that. Look at yourself. And we are very good at saying, well, I did do this, but I didn't do that. We do that all the time. And we're leveling it. And we're not looking at ourselves in the light when we do that. That's what we're called to do.
I love that you say, put rudeness up there and not honoring people as made in God's image. I find sometimes it's hard to remember that even the perpetrator was made in God's image.
Yes.
And someone who's taught me a great deal about that is Lorianne Thompson. I have never heard her dehumanize another human being. Again, for those who don't know her, she was one of the victims of sexual abuse by Ravi Zacharias. But yeah, I've never heard her do that. And I find being around her makes me a better person, because I always hear her honoring every person. It's not that she won't call them words that
they rightly have owned.
Yes.
But yeah, that to remember that every single person is made in God's image and treat them.
Yes. You will never meet somebody who is not. Even if they've got their, bodies 6 feet waiting in hell, they were made in the image of God.
Reminds me of C.S. Lewis, who said, we will never meet a mere mortal.
Right? Yes. Which does not mean being easy on it. That's one of the places many people get confused. If I think this way, but actually, if you really think that way and love somebody, they're dancing in hell, for crying out loud, if they're abusing children or something like that. The gift to them is the truth and turning on the lights so the rats run.
Absolutely. And repentance is a gift.
Yes.
And the best thing we can do is call them to repentance. And I try to keep that in the forefront of my work too, that is always my hope. Do I want them to be removed from spiritual positions? Yes. But ultimately, we pray for their soul. Ultimately, we pray that they would repent.
Yes.
When you talk about the deception that operates in these systems, there's a lot of, even psychologically, what's going on with, I think, the staff, with the people, the lay people as they hear things. And you talked about something called truth default theory. Would you explain what that is and how that often is in operation when these things begin to get revealed?
The best way to find out what that is to read that section of the book, frankly.
It is a great section, yeah.
Well, but it's not a short thing to explain, so to speak. But people choose to lie because they think the outcome will be good. If you tell the truth of a big mess, the outcome will be bad. Which there's some truth to that. You're going to blow something up if you tell the truth. It'll make a mess and everything else. And so I think that people want to keep the system okay. And so you'll see these places or whatever where the leader has been sexually abusive, maybe for years and years, and they got rid of the leader, but they don't go any deeper. They don't go any deeper into it because this is the church and we want it to thrive, and we're glad that stopped and all that kind of stuff. And we make it shallow. It's not shallow. You can't do harm like abuse or live with that harm for years or months or whatever, and then just walk away and be fine. It's not a possibility. And so part of that is understanding the different ways that people hold on to systems. This is my church. I love it. I'm going to protect it. Yes, he did those things. Yes, they're terrible, but we fired him. And that's all. It's shallow in terms of really understanding.
And when we have this vested interest, we do seem to try, and we've seen this a lot, we seem to choose who we believe. And so often, I think people are just predisposed to believing the person who has the position of spiritual authority.
Yes.
And usually the victim is someone we've never heard of. And often one of the first things that the system does to protect their basically, this is their money maker, right? This is their image as a church or as a ministry, is that they will denigrate the person who's bringing, whether it's a reporter, whether it's the victims themselves, bringing the allegations. And the people seem to be predisposed to just believing the person we want to believe.
Yes.
Yes?
Oh, yes. Yes. We want it to be okay. We want it just to go back to normal without the bad guy they figured out. It's first of all, the understanding of how it seeps into everything, contaminates everything, is not understood. But, so if the bad guy's gone, so to speak, then let's just be fine. But if the bad guy had run a track over half of the denomination and nobody could walk, what would you do? That's clear there, the harm. And it's still there, even though the people who drove the trucks got kicked out. But with this kind of thing, I think it's easier for people to push it away and say, well, the bad is gone and, this is good, whatever.
Talk about the larger system. So I often refer to it as the evangelical industrial complex. I think you refer to it a little bit differently, but it's the same thing. Often it's not just the particular institution where there's allegations being raised, but there's an entire system behind
denomination.
that. A denomination or even a camp. Like I think we saw that with Mike Bickle
Mm-hmm.
and sort of the International Houses of Prayer and their related ministries. And even that seeped into the Messianic ministries that were very much a part of this. Talk to those who maybe are somewhat naive about how these systems work, because I know before I got a job, several decades ago at Moody Radio, I didn't know this existed. I was kind of like pretty blind to it all. And I just thought these are all wonderful ministries,
Yeah.
and I think a lot of people believe that. And I wish it were all true. Some of them are wonderful ministries, but talk about that system and how it exists and how it works.
Well, even if you think of it just as a family or a big system like that, the idea of the family or the idea of a church, whatever, those are good ideas. We love the idea. We want to help the idea. We want to make it grow. We want it to get bigger and all of those things. And then something comes along that shows that there's cancer. And so sometimes we ignore that. There's plenty of organizations that do that. Sometimes the response is very superficial. And sometimes people really want to get rid of, say, those who are the source of the cancer or whatever, but they still aren't doing any treatment for the cancer.
Some of it's quite carnal too, isn't it? Just come down to, we're talking dollars and cents with some of these.
Oh my goodness, yes. Fame and a whole lot of money.
It really is amazing once you get into this, when you realize how much the celebrity pastor supports the entire industry, whether it's the mega church, whether it's publishing, whether it's Christian radio, because we rely on them for our programming and to bring the big crowds, or to bring the audience to a station. All of those things. And I think people don't realize it's billions of dollars involved in evangelicalism.
But we tell ourselves it's all God's work and his message is getting out there and people are hearing, and we have to protect that period end.
And despite the fact that these pastors are living in multi-million-dollar homes, sometimes multiple multi-million-dollar homes, and somehow we say they deserve it. Like, whether they deserve it or not, Christ didn't live like that.
Well, he certainly deserved it.
Right? And yet he never, I always go back to Philippians 2, being in very nature, God did not consider equality with God a thing to be grasped, but instead emptied himself and became a servant. And it's like we've forgotten that model.
Yes.
Sometimes I'm just like, wow.
Well, I think in many ways over, I don't know how many decades, but that the Christian world has forgotten those things, which is, I can't imagine how much grief we have caused our God. Despite
these harms that you talk about in your book and you explain, and we've talked about on this podcast, you express hope for the church. Mm-hmm. And I think a lot of folks are looking at the American church and not feeling very hopeful at all. Why do you feel that there's hope?
Because Jesus Christ exists. It goes back to him. But I have also in this work met very fine pastors, leaders, whatever, who have come in to see me, whether struggling with something or whatever, but who long to do right, to please God, to love Jesus well, to love their people well. So I have not had a diet of only those who are either victims of terrible harm or doing the harm. I think if that's all I'd had, I would have a much harder thing to think about in terms of my thoughts about God. And there was a time, I don't know how long ago it was now, some years, where I decided I can't do this anymore. It's going to make me rotten on inside. I literally got down on my knees and said to God, okay, I'm done. You'll have to let me know what other job you want me to do. Obviously, he did not do that because I'm still there. And that was a turning point for me in many ways, many of them wonderful. But, how much of that can you sit with and look at and not be made sick by it? If you're not, something's wrong with you. But if it does that to you, then how do you deal with yourself?
And I think one of the most insidious parts of religious abuse and trauma in the church is that it separates you often from community. And I have found, and I haven't been in this nearly as long as you, but that community, and I think we need to sometimes redefine it. And I mean, I'm in a house church now, and I've talked about this on numerous podcasts, but it's been a safe place for me. It's been a wonderfully healing place for me. But it's just been crucial. And I know not everybody has that opportunity. But somehow I just think we have to seek that out, even if it's really difficult for us. And I understand some people need to take a break for a while, and I totally get that. And we had a very compassionate church, our house church, where there were a number of us that were wounded, that people were willing to sit with us in that and not try to make something out of what we were doing more than just loving people, which really is, I mean, that's the essence of it all, right? But wow, that you're right. If all you encounter are toxic people doing toxic things, and I still feel this way to this day, the most beautiful people that I know still are Christians. Some of the most ugly ones that I've encountered are professing Christians, whether they know Christ. I that's between them and him. But yeah, I will still say the most loving, beautiful human beings on this planet that I know are still Christians.
Yes, and that I have found that to be true. And I've sat with people sometimes for years, working through growing up with abuse, churches abusing. I mean, it just the idea that anybody can grow and have a life and bear good fruit out of all of that it's a miracle. But I watch it; it's there, and it is a thing of beauty.
Truly is. I've said this before, but you are an inspiration to me. I know you're an inspiration to so many of the folks that are listening. And I would just love to know from you, and I know that there is no secret pill or secret, formula. But as you're looking back over 5 decades of work and your relationship with Jesus, what would be some things that you would say to us in remaining true to the end, fighting the good fight, being able to say someday before Christ, or hearing him say to us, well done, good and faithful servant. We want to get there. How can we get there?
Well, I think one of the things I would say is that I did try to quit once. I mean, I told God I was quitting. I didn't ask him anything. I just told him. Probably said something about me, of course, but I couldn't do it. I knew I couldn't do it anymore. I was either going to react in ways that were harmful to people, or just deaden myself. Those seemed to be the only options. And that was a huge turning point for me. I obviously did with it. So he won. But he responded to me and helped me see things in a way of the cross that I had not seen before, and who he is and his heart and whatever. So I feel like quitting, I think that's pretty normal, and I think a lot of people do. But I think, I literally got down on my face on the floor and said, I quit. Your turn. I don't know what to do. But he responded. And I'm so grateful. And I'm so grateful I didn't. I've learned more of him by staying. I wouldn't trade for anything. I've also seen changes, not just in individuals, which I have, but in some systems. Or at least portions of them is probably right.
I mean, obviously, God could do all of the work that we do without us. He doesn't need us. And yet he chooses to allow us to partner with what he's doing in the world. And through that, we become different people. We become, I've said it to my husband before, like, I feel sometimes like he is making us more enjoyable companions for him.
Yes, we become more like him. And you don't feel it in the middle of it, and it takes a long time, but it's somewhere along the way you look back and go, oh, it's not what I was like before. It has his aroma in it.
Well, I just want to thank you so much for your work, for your writing, and I'm just absolutely thrilled that you're coming to Restore February. So looking forward to that. And a new thing, thanks to Phil Monroe, your partner there, is having a pre-conference for counselors because, again, we need to minister to the counselors, to the caregivers, to the pastors.
Absolutely.
And so I'm thrilled that we're going to be able to do that, and you're going to be able to participate in that, and then the conference as well, and speaking to a lot of people who've been through an awful lot of church hurt. So very much looking forward to that. But thank you so much for taking the time today, and thank you for this new book, even though, we weren't able to have you to the last Restore, which for me personally was a sacrifice, but definitely worth it in the book. So thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. And I am glad for the work that you do. It touches people whose souls have been hurt. Gives them a taste of light and love. So, blessings on you.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to The Roys Report, a podcast dedicated to reporting the truth and restoring the church. I'm Julie Roys, and I would love to get you a copy of Diane's latest book, When the Church Harms God's People. This is our premium to donors this month, so if you give $40 or more to The Roys Report, we'll send you a copy of Diane's book. As many of you know, your gifts to this work is what makes it possible. We can't do anything that we do, from our podcast to our daily reporting to our investigations, without your support. So please consider helping us out, and when you do, we'll get you a copy of Diane's book, When the Church Harms God's People. To donate and get the book, just go to julieroys, spelled ROYS.com/donate. That's julieroys.com/donate. Also, just a quick reminder to subscribe to The Roys Report on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. That way you won't miss any of these episodes. And while you're at it, I'd really appreciate it if you'd help us spread the word about the podcast by leaving a review. And then please share the podcast on social media so more people can hear about this great content. Again, thanks so much for joining me today. Hope you were blessed and encouraged.